This is Daria Shabbat with Corporate Profile. We are here at Kings County Distillery, the oldest operating whiskey distillery in New York, located in Brooklyn. Kings County Distillery makes award-winning moonshine and bourbon. Co-founder Colin Spoolman will show us today how to take a simple grain and turn it into liquid gold. So let's go and find out how it's done. So I'm here next to Colin Spoolman. Colin, tell us, how did you get into the whiskey making business?
So I grew up in Kentucky and grew up in a dry county. So whenever we wanted to go get alcohol, we had to go to a bootlegger. And growing up in Kentucky, I had this experience both with moonshine and then, of course, everybody knows bourbon. So after living in New York for a little while, I got interested started with moonshine, trying to kind of see what it would take to make a little homemade alcohol. And then that's illegal. So got worried about that becoming a problem. So I got worried that we were going to get into trouble. And that's when we looked into getting an actual distillery license, which we got about 3 years ago.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you. And now we make moonshine and bourbon legally.
So Colin, you're talking to a complete layman. What is the difference between moonshine and bourbon?
So moonshine generally refers to something that's unaged, that people drink right off the still. And then bourbon is an aged version of that whiskey. And around the 1870s, people started to age their whiskey in barrels for a good period of time, which can have a mellowing effect on the whiskey. It kind of calms it down, tames it a little bit.
It makes it smoother.
And so most whiskey historically in the United States was either made from corn or rye. And corn recipe whiskey is bourbon. That's how the government defines bourbon, as a whiskey made primarily from corn. So bourbon has to be aged to some degree, but it doesn't specify how long.
Oh, it doesn't.
So we have a couple different types of bourbon. The one that we have out right now is only aged for about 15, 18 months. But we've only been around for a short time, so.
That's true. You are the oldest whiskey distillery in New York, but yet you opened up in 2010, right?
Yeah. So we're the oldest, but not very old.
Still quite young.
Yes, exactly.
But successful. So to take it one step further, Scotch. What is the difference between whiskey and Scotch?
Well, Scotch and bourbon and rye are all different types of whiskey. Scotch has to be made in Scotland. That's kind of the only rule. I mean, we actually are making a Scotch-style whiskey that's made with an all-barley recipe and is aged in used barrels, which are some of the sort of distinctions of Scotch. But the biggest rule is that it has to be made in Scotland. And as far as those sort of, to take it further, if bourbon is made from corn, Scotch is made from exclusively barley, and is generally aged in used barrels that have held bourbon before. And so the second time around, the barrels lose a little bit of their oomph. And so Scotch is generally aged for much longer for that reason.
Is there any specific type of wood that has to be used for the barrels?
In the U.S., it has to be oak.
Okay.
I don't know what the rules are outside the United States, but...
Why is it oak?
Oak is a very dense wood and works well for making barrels.
Okay.
Beyond that...
Does it give it a certain aroma?
It does, yeah, absolutely. And what happens inside the barrel is the barrel's charred on the inside, so that charcoal filters the whiskey, but it also caramelizes the sap of the tree. And so it's that caramel kind of tree flavor and color that ends up giving the whiskey its character. So this is the distillery floor where all of the spirit gets distilled, and everything begins here behind us with grain. And so I said that bourbon has to be by law majority corn. So this big huge bag, that is 1 ton of organic corn that's grown upstate near the
You use organic corn.
So we use organic and local corn, which is not something I would have insisted on, but we tried a number of different types of corn, and the organic corn made better whiskey.
Yeah.
It was a little more earthier, a little more complex. So that's what we use for the corn. And then most whiskey needs some amount of malted barley, and to malt grain means you allow it to germinate slightly. And then you dry the grain in a kiln, and it has a little bit of a different enzyme profile than a dormant grain. And so when you mix that malted barley in with the corn, it will immediately convert the starch in the corn to sugar.
Colin, this barrel looks like it's breathing and it's alive. What is happening in there?
Right. So this is fermenting mash, and when you mix the grain together and add yeast, that's called the mash. And so the yeast are consuming dissolved oxygen and sugar, and they're producing carbon dioxide and alcohol. So in a way, the whiskey is sort of carbonating in the same way that beer or some wines are carbonated.
So right now it's not drinkable, right?
It's not. I mean, it's technically drinkable. I wouldn't recommend it. It's like a very, it's like a corn-based beer, basically, is what we're making so far. It's like a chunky beer, which I wouldn't.
Very nutritional.
I wouldn't recommend drinking it, but you could. And at the end of about 4.5 days, this will be, in our case, about 6% alcohol.
Okay, and what happens next?
And then it goes into the stills, which is where the real magic happens. So these are the stills, and these are big copper kettles, and they boil that mash, or the fermented mash, to steam. And the steam goes up the tall column into a pipe that has cold water running through it. And the cold water, when the steam hits that, it will condense down to droplets and then run out. And that's basically all that distillation is. You just turn something to steam and condense it back down.
So now we're in the barrel room, the final step of the distillation process. Colin, tell us about this room.
So this room is where the whiskey goes to age. So to do that, you just put it into barrels and it just sits.
For how long?
Well, it depends. I mean, most of the bourbon that we're selling now is very young. It's only a couple years old. But we have some bourbon that will probably go 6 years, 10 years, different types of whiskey that could even go longer than that.
Exciting. So in your opinion, what is the best whiskey? Like, how old does it have to be be well-rounded? And
well, yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a sort of a myth that whiskey, the older, the better. I think that's, people kind of look at a number on the bottle and it's
I totally bought into that myth.
But there's so many different factors that go into what makes good whiskey, both ingredient-wise and distillation-wise.
Organic corn.
Right. So by putting a lot of emphasis on ingredients and the distillation process, we can take more latitude with the aging process.
So Colin, tell us, what is the difference between your homemade whiskey and, let's say, a whiskey like Jameson or Jack Daniels?
Right. I would say the major distinction is that we put way more emphasis on the ingredients and the distillation process. We use these very traditional types of stills, which are kind of unique outside of Scotland. And that, then as far as the aging goes, we have sort of a different aging process. It's a shorter period of time right now. So that gives it a little bit of a different flavor profile, but it's much more labored over. I mean, we spend a lot of time making every single barrel. In fact, we write the name of the distillery on every barrel. Because we just don't have a whole lot of mechanization, and that, I think, ends up giving you a nicer product. But I think it's up to people to decide what they like, and so that's sort of the fun part.
There's lots of love in those barrels, guys.
And when we're tasting barrels, we really look for notes of sort of cinnamon and black pepper and nutmeg and kind of like Christmas spices.
Okay. I can taste the cinnamon, definitely.
Yeah, right. But there is no cinnamon. It's just really, it picks that up from the barrel, which is kind of remarkable that it gets this real complexity of like spicy flavors. And the only ingredients are corn, barley, and yeast and barrel, I guess. People are, to some extent, rediscovering whiskey. I think it had a period where people really gravitated to vodka and, were really into vodka for a while. And I think as more people learn about whiskey and get into it, there's a lot more differentiation bottle to bottle in whiskeys as there are really with vodka, just by nature of the process. As a maker of whiskey, you want to be able to explain to people why what you do is distinctive. And because whiskey does have all these great variants and different styles and different expressions, to be able to be a part of that is really cool.
Cool. And for more information on your tours, we can go on your website, correct?
Right, which is kingscountydistillery.com.
And for all of you whiskey lovers and collectors out there, this definitely belongs in your collection. Till next time, I'm Daria Shabbat with CorporateProfile.com.